This is On Diversity, a podcast series by the Institute of Policy Studies, Singapore. This is the third season, and I'm your host, Liang Kaixin, Associate Director of IPS and also a former journalist. Today's episode is in conjunction with IPS's annual flagship conference, Singapore Perspectives 2023, and the theme is Ageism at Work. Today we have Mr Heng Chee, Deputy Secretary General of National Trades Union Congress, NTUC, and also Senior Minister of State for Defence. We also have Dr. Helen Ko, Associate Professor, who is part of the Master and PhD in Gerontology Programmes at the S.R. Nathan School of Human Development, Singapore University of Social Sciences. Welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah.
I'll just go straight because, Singapore has one of the most rapidly aging populations in the world. And so our labour force participation rate for Singapore residents aged 65 years and above was at 30.1%. And this percentage is actually expected to increase. At the same time, we have a survey by the Ministry of Manpower released this year, which found that the incidence of workplace discrimination has dropped after 4 years, but among those who have reported that there was discrimination at the workplace, the top reason given was that it was because of ageism, because of older age. So I would like to ask the both of you, what does ageism look like in the workplace in Singapore, and also how prevalent is it in Singapore? Who should we go first?
Okay, maybe I'll start first.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I think the ageism, in the sense of how it would look like at the workplace, I remember one participant of my training program was just sharing with me how this older worker had to disguise his age, so to speak, to land himself an interview. He applied for many, many jobs but couldn't get even an interview. So what he did was that he actually used a photograph of himself, a much younger photo of himself.
Old photo.
Yes, very old. And then omitted a lot of the work experiences. Because if he were to list all his work experiences from what year to what year, they would know his age, right? So what he did was he just decided that, okay, I'll omit all that. And then, true enough, the person that was conducting the training for is actually a HR manager, I think, one of the employers. So she said, my boss asked me to interview this person. Then after that, she told me, she said, after she knew about this man's sort of age, she said, do you know how old he is? She asked her boss, Well, this is one example of how ageism could look like in the sense of lending themselves an interview for seniors. So there's one example, yeah.
I think when we talk about ageism, first of all, I think we want to distinguish between ageism and aging. Because a person's chronological age and his or her experience or expectations or perception of whether there's been ageist attitudes expressed toward him or her differs from person to person. So if you were to ask this question, does ageism exist in the world and in history? The answer must be yes. Could there be ageism in Singapore? Even now, the answer is there probably is. And the question is, to what extent is this a huge problem? Studies will continue to be done to gauge the size of it, but obviously it is something that the tripartite partners know exists in some cases and can exist, and therefore you need to put in certain guide rails in order to better safeguard the interests of older workers or mature workers right up front. So do things either by way of legislation, guidelines, promotion of right practices, so that people are more aware of it, both employers as well as workers, each of us as we age. And more of us would then be more predisposed, hopefully, to do the right things, knowing that if you don't, then there is also recourse on the part of the employee who feels that he has been disadvantaged because of age. It is a realistic approach to things, and the outcome of that is, as Kaixin, you pointed out, the employment rate for older workers stands at about 3 in 10, and actually if you trace back over the last 10 years, it has actually gone up, even during COVID. It is an approach that works, but it is a journey that never ends.
So, Dr. Ko, I think you mentioned about the difficulty of landing a job interview, but I think there are also some other ways that ageism can appear in the workplace, right? So actually I was looking at another study and they were saying that the prevalence of, the term okay boomer, which also may make it not so conducive for elderly workers to be in the workplace. So other than that, also people would say that these older workers, they may be less educated or lack relevant skills. Do you think these reasons hold water, and how can older workers be supported?
Well, I would say that if we want to promote an inclusive society, these reasons certainly should not stand. Our society has always focused, and for many years, on promoting an inclusive society. So I would say that older people have contributed so much to our nation building. And so certainly we should assist them, facilitate their employment. And I think one of the ways which is very, very important in my mind is that, which I've also carried out some research in this area, is that we need to not just upskill them, but we need to upskill them with appropriately trained instructors. I've conducted a lot of trainings for older workers. So I hear a lot of such difficulties, challenges. And in my research that I've carried out, for the lower wage, lower skilled older workers, I did this research a few years ago, and they have cited the difficulties in terms of attending, in fact, they do not want to enroll for courses because of fears, lack of confidence, and instructors do not understand them, the challenges that they experience. So these are some reasons, and many of them, especially for the lower educated ones with, in fact, very little basic education, they really struggle. They actually mention two steep learning curves that they are negotiating. Technology part, and then the other part is the content. Right? The study that I was engaged in is on workplace literacy program, the basic English, basic literacy program. So they had tremendous difficulties because of that. And as a result, they do not enroll for classes because they are afraid that they can't, negotiate that kind of, that two steep learning curves that I mentioned. So I think instructors of older workers need to be appropriately trained to understand that some of these challenges and difficulties of older workers, and use training approaches, methodologies, delivery methods that would resonate with them, that they could identify and connect with. Yeah. So these are some important points to note. Then the other part I would say is that IT ambassadors, if we want to continue to integrate older workers into the workplace, then we need to, in fact, a study conducted recently by CARE, Center for Aging Research and Education under Duke NUS, revealed that older workers, they did acknowledge that technology is one of the greatest challenges that they experience. So what they propose is that if they could have patient guidance from IT ambassadors, all right, at the workplace, that would be very helpful. All right. And another one would be, other studies, research elsewhere in overseas, in UK, for example, have also shown that job flanking on the job training that is closely aligned to the actual job requirements would be very helpful for these older workers in particular. Yeah.
Maybe I will come in from the point made by Kaixin earlier about statements like "yes, boomer," not helpful, and statements like "what do you expect out of the strawberry generation," not helpful.
That's true.
So it is statements like that, right? That you have a broad brush thing and you knock everybody as a cohort, knowing that actually it is not true. I was very impressed. This was quite some years ago with a radio advertisement. It was like that. No? First, you hear a piece of very nice classical music being played. And then everybody was expecting the question to come, who's the composer? What's the name of the piece? But no, the question was, how old was the musician? And obviously, it was a radio program, no way you can tell. And that advertisement was precisely to say that you cannot actually tell or assume something just by asking, how old are you? And just now, Helen was talking about learning curves. Actually, the other curve I want to talk about is the bell curve.
Okay.
Frankly, because in other words, any age, you're going to get a bell curve. You have a younger cohort, you're going to have lousy workers, average workers, very good workers. You have an older cohort, you are going to have very bad older workers, average older workers, and very good and fast learning older workers. So again, I think we want to avoid this thing about trying to generalize and say that if you're an older worker, you can't learn, because you can equally find examples of such among younger workers. So the thing is really to afford people the environment and the tools with which those who want to help themselves can be encouraged, and then there are mechanisms and structures through which they can help themselves. So I just wanted to say that we are hardly out of COVID yet. So 2 over years of COVID. And one of the good things about COVID has taught all of us, in the area of technology, for example, regardless of our age, that lo and behold, in a nice way, we discover to our delight that actually we are all quite capable of learning new technological apps and other tools compared to before COVID. So sometimes necessity is the mother of invention or adaptation. So actually, by doing this, various things happened. You want to talk about flexible work arrangements, then employers find that actually there's a lot more scope. You could access bigger pools of talented workers that way. Workers of all ages, including older workers, are required, because the business model has to adapt to survive. They have to learn new skills in order, like all other workers, in order to hold on to the jobs better and lower the risk of being displaced, right? And I think everybody therefore understands the situation, puts an effort, and goes further than he or she would otherwise have. So I think this is also a very good illustration, both as an encouragement to older workers. There's this old cooking program called Yan Can Cook.
Yes.
The chef, Martin Yan,
Yes.
right? He looks like your uncle next door. And it was that basically to say is that if Yan can cook, so can you. In other words, never rule yourself out. I work in the NTUC, so let me share a little bit about what we are trying to do, right? A bit of koyo. But you see, the serious point is really this. I totally agree with what Helen said just now in terms of maybe there are different pedagogies.
Actually, for older adults, we call it gerontologies.
Okay.
Gerontology, gerontologies.
So you have to adapt to different ways of teaching according to the needs and the preferences and so on. That's one part. The other thing is really structures and mechanisms.
Yes.
I think it's not so easy to say that I give you money or I subsidize the cost fees up front and then please go help yourself, because what do I get trained in? In the right thing that's in demand and so on and so forth, right? What's the thing that my company needs next?
Yes, relevancy. We're talking about relevancy.
So that then I get myself trained in good time, and then I will still be needed by the company in the next phase of growth. So you might have heard of this thing called the Company Training Committees, or CTCs, that NTUC has been trying to promote. Essentially, it's this. It's just that for companies that already have mechanisms like that, whatever you call them, fine. But if for companies that do not yet have set up mechanisms like that, then you have, if it is unionized, then you have union reps. If not, then get worker reps in any case.
Yes.
Work together with management, sit down, talk about the future plans, talk about the skills needs, and then talk about how you could give everybody a fair go at it. And this one, I just wanted to say that sometimes the worker becomes the worker you assume he or she is. So in other words, if you think that I'm an older worker, you meaning the employer. If you, the employer, thinks that I'm the older worker, I may not have much runway left with your company, so you don't give me the chance to get trained. Then what happens is that obviously then my skills are more likely to become outdated, and then you say that I cannot perform. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts.
Yes.
So one of the things about tackling ageism in a practical way in a workplace, for example, is to see to it through mechanisms like CTCs or similar, that you enable the company to train its workforce broadly. So it's a point about fairness, but it is also a point about effectiveness, because the company actually needs the best workforce, and you really don't want to cause obsolescence of your older workers because of neglect, and not because of lack of capability.
Yes.
Mr. Heng, actually, I have 2 points that came out from what you said. It struck me quite deeply because number one is bell curve. Because I was also looking at the MOM survey, and it said that the main reason why workers over 40 who felt that they were discriminated is because they felt that it was related to career development, salary-related matters, and promotion opportunities. So obviously bell curve is often related to our appraisal, whether like your supervisor will give them a good rating and not. And I guess sometimes some older workers may felt that they are not appraised properly according to their age.
That may be true, but I actually really want to emphasize that point. I'm so glad that Mr. Heng has brought that part up. Two very important concepts that we need to remember is that older workers are very heterogeneous.
Okay, they're very different.
Very diverse, right? So at each cohort, hugely diverse in terms of their cognitive abilities, their functional abilities, their life experiences, their educational backgrounds. So because of that, it's really very diverse. And older workers itself, you say that cohort already spent a few decades, right? So hugely diverse. So we can't lump them together. So again, this is something that for us to really bear in mind, when we plan programs, policies, and what have you, whatever that we may be trying to develop for older workers. Then the other point that I really would like to emphasize is assumptions, all right, which you mentioned, assumptions. We make a lot of assumptions, and very often because of that we hold a lot of stereotypical views, wrong perceptions, beliefs about older workers, and we really should refrain from that. Like you have said, Mr. Heng has mentioned about, they are so different, right? And for each group, you've got young people who refuse to learn to.
That's true, that's
right?
true.
So, we have come across that too. So this is something that is very important. Of course, the part about self-fulfilling prophecy, I fully agree. And older workers themselves, the other point that I would really like to add is that older workers themselves should not imbibe those values and beliefs and perceptions held by society about them, and thereby become self-limiting. Right, limiting themselves, to think that I can't do it because I'm so old already. I'm already 60 years old, I'm already 63 years old, 65 years old, so I can't learn and pick up those skills. So I think older workers themselves would also have to be very mindful about that.
So you might very well have companies that work on that basis, So in other words, right, when it comes to appraisal, maybe my company, I will go on the basis that if you are above a certain age, I will not ever give you a better grading than, say, C or something like that, I think companies that do things like that is ultimately acting against its own self-interest. Why do I say that? First of all, you demoralize the good older workers amongst your workforce. That's number one, immediate own goal. Number two, those who are not yet old in your workforce, look at what you are doing and know that everybody will age. You think the good ones will stay with you? That's two. Number three, we have an aging population, an aging workforce. And there's only so much that you can borrow from the rest of the world that society can withstand at any one point. So what it means is that if you look at which part of your workforce, right, is actually the growing part. It's the mature workers. So if you don't know how to make use of the part of the resource that is growing, it is ultimately an own goal. So I just wanted to mention this and remind our employers. Again, I'm not accusing employers at large, but it's just a plea to, a reminder, and an explanation to employers that if you look at the situation, we do business, so you have to look at the market. And if you say the labor market, then do you need people? Do you need good people? Do you need people you have to stay sharp so that you can compete? That must be in your interest as a business, you see. So if you look at it that way, then those kinds of appraisal by assumption, really, you have to reevaluate that. The other thing is that as people work longer, and this is also facilitated by our laws. So we have this Retirement and Re-employment Age Act,
Yes.
and we are increasing the statutory retirement age and statutory re-employment age ceilings, right? So what it means is that all things being equal, the older worker will have a better chance and choice to continue to contribute. So in that context, how do you keep that worker sharp? So a company also has got to look after things like succession, renewal, development of younger people, and so on and so forth. So when you have a workforce that stay in work for more years, how do you actually plan that longer work life? May not be like what we used to be. You come out of school, you work, and then at, say, 55, you retire, and then that's it, And if it goes up to 70, then how do you plan? So, for example, recently in an effort by the Singapore National Employers Federation, as part of the outcomes of the tripartite work group on older workers, so they came out with this structured career planning, which is to help our employers better career plan with our workers. Don't wait until 62 to say, how shall we spend the next 3 years or something?
Absolutely.
Think of it at 40 or something. Maybe there's actually 2 parts to it, and so on and so forth. So there are structural changes. The HR profession must also come in and learn, understand, and lead the way. So many things have to adjust. It's not just the CEO, it's not just the worker.
Great point. And I just want to pick up on that career crafting.
Okay.
We call that career crafting. And especially, for the older workers, I fully agree. In fact, I just want to even illustrate that with an example. I remember a participant of my training program, this older worker, he was in his 50s. And he shared this. He said, I've been a technician, for the last 30 years. But really, actually, in my heart, I really want to be a chef. I love to cook, and he has even attended classes on, at the CCs, to learn how to cook, and he cooked for his family every weekend. And he said, but because in my younger days, I had to be a technician because it brings in more money, because, it helps him to support his family. So, but when I reached that age of 50s or so, I really, I have enough of, after working for about 30 years in my job, I have enough of that. I really want to be a chef. And so if we can do a career development kind of program in the company, whether it be through workshops or whatever, assess the older workers' abilities, skills, interests, and align it to these various factors, then it is actually very, very useful. It is a win-win situation because the older worker would be more satisfied and motivated. Right? And the company can actually deploy him perhaps to the canteen, right? And he could utilize his skills and his interests.
So what Helen has quoted by way of an example is a second win in a different vocation.
Yeah.
Earlier this year, about February, I think, I visited the bus academy and spoke to some of the technicians there. So they have been working on diesel engines, buses, right? Petrol engines. And then now they are going into electric vehicles. So these are different, but if you know the skills, there are different skills, then you can continue to be a bus technician. But totally different skills, and you can carry on. So you can extend your lease in a very useful and important way to the company, staying in the same vocation. So there are many different ways of doing it. But the important thing is really that no point hoping that things don't change so that I don't have to figure something new. Things will change. The thing is that how can I change with it? And then society as a whole, and employers, unions, workers themselves, government, come together to enable and facilitate the adaptation more smoothly. That is important.
I just want to go back to one more point about the pedagogy and the gerontology part, right? Because it struck me quite deeply because I used to train some of my colleagues on using content management system. So it's like CMS, how to upload stuff on website and all that. And it never occurred to me, like, I have to really approach it differently for people of different age group. And sometimes I find that, our older colleagues, they tend to try and then very quickly they will forget the steps, or the steps are too complicated and they couldn't catch up.
Yes.
So I think this part seems to be missing from a lot of our workplaces actually. A lot of times employers, they will say, okay, let's go for training. And then it's just training for everyone without taking into account their age.
Absolutely. Of course, having said that, we also must remember that there are some very high-performing older workers who do not really require that. They could, very well.
In that,
very well. I've got an 82-year-old senior, and he's like, a number of years ago, he was like using the iPad, iPhone without any problem. So we cannot assume there are exceptions. In that sense. But having said that, if we are looking at helping, in particular, the lower wage, lower skilled age group without with very limited education, then they do find it more challenging, generally speaking, and because that basic level of foundation is not there. So this is where the relationship part, the rapport building, understanding them, empathizing with them, their conditions, their background, their fears, their lack of confidence would be very important. So that there is actually a lot of, basically provide them with a lot of assurances and, a lot of confidence enhancing kind of strategies.
Actually, it's more than assurances and confidence and encouragement, although those are very important. Without those, it really is a non-starter. But it is really in the scientific methods involved as well.
Yes.
You see, what happens is that if you go back, say, 40 years, it's a different world. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, really people were talking about and expecting lifelong employment. So you finish school, then you find an employer somewhere, and chances are that you will stay with the employer until you retire, and that employer, that company can actually survive that long to employ you until you retire. All that has changed, right? So what it means is that first, people are living longer. That's in the case of Singapore. They are working more years, or at least the laws and so on would enable that if they choose to. Then what has happened is that technology is also changing on the side.
Very quickly.
Yeah, so here you have your supply of time, namely your work life, has lengthened. But the requirements are much more in flux than, say, 50 years ago and 40 years ago. So what it means is that this relearning or learning something completely different for the next part of your work life becomes more and more likely with time. So this means that the methods which were optimized for a situation where you teach the person when the person was in school, teenager and so on, and then after that we finish school and then the rest of it is learn on the job until he retires, it's different. When this person has to come back at 30, he's coming back at 40, he's coming back at 50 and learning different things. And how do you teach a 30, 40, 50, 60? You cannot again assume that it is the same way.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So our institutes of higher learning, our training providers, basically the entire profession is also on a learning curve.
Yes. My students, my graduate students are very diverse, from 20s to 70s. Okay, I've got students who enrolled from, they're in their 20s up to 70s. So you have like 3 generations learning together. This is another one, multiple generation. You asked something about multi-generation.
I'm a young punk, I guess. And I got a bit impatient and I'm like,
Yeah. So there's a very important part in the sense of older workers, older adults. How do you then train them? We need to be cognizant about the age-associated changes. Right? And then, it's, for example, information processing abilities, memory changes. And so how then do you help them, all right, negotiate that? And at the same time, learning something new, you talk about reskilling, upskilling, which is really very pertinent. So we need to be very mindful, multi-generational learning. And I think this is going to be, going forward, multi-generational learning is going to be a big thing as well. Within the same, sort of, whether it's classroom or whatever kind of multi-generational learning, even at the workplace, not just in the classroom.
Indeed.
Yeah,
multi-generational, say, is another way of perhaps saying it's going to be age diverse. So one part of keeping our older workforce sharp is actually going beyond the individual skills and so on, but it's also the environment. So there are also health and safety things that companies need to take care of and make that more doable. So, for example, lighting, for example, certain hazards, all those kinds of things are knowledge and skills that companies need also to pick up and in order to make their jobs more, age universal. And then they can keep the good ones longer.
I think we were talking a lot about like blue collar workers, and I think Helen, you were talking about technicians, we were talking about chefs and all that. But, going back to the appraiser part, like how do we grade workers and all that. And I feel that there's a very big issue that will come up, which are the PMET workers. When they get to the age of 40 or 50 years old, a lot of them will end up facing the prospect of being retrenched, actually. It's not even just getting a grade C. So that would be very horrifying because, like, if they are still employed, you can say that the companies can train them, right? But once they drop out of the workforce or they lose a job, how are we going to help them to get employed again and at a significant, meaningful level and not like drop down to a blue collar job, you see? How do we face this issue? How do we solve this issue?
I think it is definitely very challenging. I think probably NTUC has got quite a number of some
NTUC, we need to help
initiatives
these workers.
in this direction already. I believe we have rolled out quite a few of these initiatives. Yeah.
Oh, you're looking at me now.
Yes, we are all looking at you.
No, certainly, we assure all workers in Singapore,
Yes.
PME as well as non-PME, NTUC will always try our best for you. And then the question then is, what are you doing? So PME, you are right, and it's another group. When you say PME again, is age diverse.
Yeah.
This is another way of looking at the workforce, right? So one way of looking at the workforce is by age. Another way of looking at it is whether it's PME and so on. So if you look at PME and you look at the MOM stats, then the percentage of the workforce that is reckoned as PME has also grown over the years. Why? Well, it reflects our education system, it reflects our economy, it reflects the sort of industries that we attract and have set up in Singapore and the range of jobs that they do. Number two is that about 2 years ago, we did a project, we call it the PME Task Force. So they went out and engaged, sought the views of up to about 10,000 PMEs, and they came up with some recommendations, one of which was indeed this thing about the concern amongst PMEs that in the flux of the labor market, where you cannot assume lifelong employment anymore, and displacement can sometimes be long, and sometimes you could really fall off a cliff, How do you then recover? And of course, then there's also this related concern that if you are an older PME versus a younger PME, the concern is that it might take longer to find a new job as well. And in that process, the difference between your last drawn and your new pay may actually be a bigger gap compared to a younger PME.
But that would be very difficult, right?
So there are all these concerns, right?
Yeah.
So we have to acknowledge these concerns, and the question is that then what do you make of all this? We are studying it very carefully, and we will go and discuss and work something much more in detail with our tripartite partners. But roughly speaking, I think what is quite clear now is this. For sure, you have to plan for an environment where it is not lifelong employment, which means to say that we are going to encounter an environment where there will be gaps in employment. Even if the next new job is the same type and level as the old one, there could also be gaps. So it's not going to be continuous. So that is one. And therefore, if there are gaps, right, what additional measures by way of government policy and support, by way of tripartite cooperation, can you put in place, right, to give such workers more of a safety net, the in-between, or more of a trampoline? As SM Taman has also mentioned, as a concept, right? Because you have to plan on the basis that there will now be these kinds of gaps. In an environment of lifelong employment, there aren't such gaps, correct? So if the situation has changed, then how do you plan for that? And what measures? We have to discuss. Then the other one is this. If a person doesn't end up being displaced, then obviously it's much more merciful, right? Then it's a question of, learning from diesel or petrol into electric and so on. So in that situation, what more can you do to enhance the value of the worker in his own company so that he's able to adapt and lower the chances of displacement due to skills obsolescence? Other things like how do we better take care of the health and so on and so forth, those are also related. So if you look at it conceptually, in other words, right, if you can save a person from being displaced in the first place, by matching him as best as possible and adapting with the company. So back comes the CTC concept. So you can adapt together, you stay together, and you grow together. That's one. But you can't do that in every case because sometimes it's beyond the control of the company, beyond the control of the worker. Things happen within, you get a global recession or something like that. And then what do you do in order to better and more quickly match people into the new jobs? How can we further improve our matching mechanisms? And in the sustenance part in between, what more can we do? So those are the sort of practical things that we are discussing.
Right. I think those are really great. And just to add to that, I think at the individual level, this is where the individuals really have to come in to really every 5-10 years take stock, assess, what else do I need to do to remain updated, to remain current, to ensure that I will still have a job. Of course, notwithstanding that, there could be, recession and whatever, and disruptions. So that is beyond the person's control. But as far as possible, perhaps individuals could be self-directed, take charge, and proactively keep current and to maintain their to prevent skills or obsolescence.
I also wanted to come in on another one before I forget. Just now I mentioned that if you look at MOM figures, right, the percentage of the workforce reckoned as PME has been growing over the years. So now, if you go by that PMET definition, is already more than half, and PME is more than a third, and both are growing. So now imagine a situation where your last PME, right, if you line them up, is at the 1/3 mark is growing. So in other words, you must expect that more and more of your workforce will become PME in time to come. Then you have to also then think, just because I give you a PME title, job title, but if I line you up and you are actually at the 3/4 mark from the top, then what would be your needs? What would be your worries? And what should I do to support you? Will be different from if you are at the top 5%, right? So again, PME, using Helen's word, it's not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous.
Yes. Yeah.
In the end, if 100% of our workforce is called PME, then obviously you're going to get the spread again. So we again have to drill down and ultimately be able to customize. So our systems, processes, structures will have got to be very adaptable.
Yes. So customization and individualization will be very important to ensure a good person to job fit. And this is where, back to our point about assumptions, and not assume that, just because the person is 60 years old, he or she cannot be doing certain jobs.
Of course, but is there any need to redesign or create older worker-friendly jobs? How can we do that?
Well, I would say that actually, again, redesigning and designing jobs, it should be to maintain health, so to extend working lifespan is critical for all, not just for older workers, for all. If you look at Norway, for example, I remember visiting this company, this organization, very, very interesting. They are engaged in this oil industry and employing a number of older workers. So what they did was that they invested rather heavily on ergonomic design as well as extending the health span of their workers. All right. So I think that is very critical. So it's not just job redesigning, I would say, is something that is for all workers, just to maintain their workability. Yeah. And when we talk about older worker job, I actually don't really like that term of jobs that are for older workers, because there is that underlying assumption, if we talk about that, is that older workers cannot perform certain kind of jobs, which I think we are trying to refrain from that, because actually there are some older workers who could actually perform, as well. In fact, perhaps even better than some younger workers. Right? So it is not just restricted. Having said that, there could be certain jobs that, in a sense, in general, older workers may be a little bit more suited. For example, some customer-facing kind of work. They are pretty good in handling. TAFEP research has actually shown that where there are fewer customer confrontations attributed to the presence of older workers. So if there are older workers, they tend to have, fewer customer confrontations. So in that sense, they are pretty good with interpersonal skills, problem-solving skills, and managing certain crisis sort of situations. So in that sense, they are good with that. And of course, mentoring, coaching, those, I think we know that pretty well.
Maybe I can help with a couple of examples where there is a difference between the older worker and the younger worker.
Sure.
So for example, we'll say, let's say physically, you may not be as strong as a younger worker, right?
So physical.
I just want to qualify. The physical condition of the average 50-year-old today is much better than the physical condition of a 50-year-old 40 years ago. Okay? But at any one point, the 50-year-old perhaps is not as physically strong as, let's say, a 25-year-old. In the same point in time, all things being equal, I'm talking about averages. So what can be done, right? Assuming you want to take care of this aspect as well, so that you are able to help extend the effective working life of a good attitude, otherwise high-performing older worker. So, for example, there are jobs that got redesigned because the equipment got introduced to make it less laborious and less tedious and less strenuous. I'll give you one specific example. If you go to hotels, for example, if you say the work of chambermaids and they have to change the bed sheets and so on, they lift the bed, it's heavy duty. So what have been done over the years, other than to say that please keep doing and I'll give you incentives by the number of rooms you do, there are also hotels that have gone into using lifting devices to help lift the beds and so on. So it makes it lighter. There are hotels that have paired the older one with the younger one so that, the older one knows how quickly tuck things in and the younger one has the strength. There are so many different ways in which jobs can actually be repackaged, redesigned, and recombined. Sometimes with technology, sometimes by processing, sometimes by combining different skills and physical attributes of their manpower. So that's one. Another example would be in the security sector. So basically the typical one is you do patrolling in order to check. And this can also be quite strenuous. And of course, with technology, then you're talking about control rooms, cameras, and so on. And then you can actually activate response units by looking at the TVs, as opposed to walking and then feeling more and more challenged that way. In fact, I remember the Prime Minister in this year's National Day rally, he quoted another example in the port, right, where there was this worker who used to work in the tower crane and he had to climb and be alone up there, and it wasn't easy at all. But now again they have computerized and the efficiency of the operations have gone up. His value add, his productivity as a result has gone up, and he is controlling not one crane but multiple cranes, key cranes. So all these kinds of things can be done. The question then will be that how do we actually bring such knowledge and share such knowledge amongst employers of related industries, and then what can be done to help them and nudge these kinds of movements. And then at the same time, looking over to the worker side to say that now, climbing up and working as a solo in a key crane is not the same as controlling it in the control room. So again, new skill sets. So if everybody do their part, then there is extension.
Right now, we're talking about redesign and all that. But of course, there's one question that's on a lot of people's minds about the retirement age, right? If you can work until then, that would be great. But if you can't even continue to work, what's the meaning of having this 67, 68 years of retirement age when no employer wants to employ me, right? Can we get your perspective on this, about this retirement age in Singapore? And also, obviously, the other part is about the retirement adequacy. Do they have enough basic retirement sum for the CPF, for the older workers? How do we look at this retirement age?
May I go first on this one? Sure. I'm very passionate about this one. First of all, I want to say that we have a piece of legislation, we have a law called the RRA, which is the Retirement and Re-employment Age Act. Our statutory retirement age, whatever the existing number, the definition of our retirement age is quite different from that of retirement ages in many other countries.
Okay.
Why do I say that? In many other countries, when they have a retirement age, the understanding is that when you reach that age, you must retire. You must retire. In Singapore, it's not like that. Our statutory retirement age says that let's say if the retirement age is 63, statutory retirement age is 63, then no company operating in Singapore is allowed to call up a worker and says, who is, say, 59, and says that, you've rendered very good service to our company, you perform very well, everything is very good, and according to our company policy, company retirement age is 59, so thank you very much, and so on. So you are not allowed to do that. So in other words, ours is a safeguard put in so that a person cannot be retired on no other reason than age before he or she reaches the statutory retirement age. Okay, so
we're protecting someone's job, actually.
So ours is not the end.
Yes.
Ours is to make sure that the end doesn't come just because of age, before that age. And also, when a person reaches that retirement age, the person can continue working. So therein comes this re-employment age. Okay, so you tack on. And actually, even beyond the re-employment age ceiling, if a person wants to continue working and the company, though not legally obliged, wants to employ that person because the person has value, has relevant experience, totally encouraged, totally the possible and legal in Singapore. May not be the case in some other places. So this is what it means. Now, just because you have a law, does it mean to say that you always have a job? Well, it doesn't mean that either. So the law cannot guarantee that aspect. So in order to have a job, so first of all, there must be the company. And so it is the overall macroeconomics of it. We must make it attractive for people to start business here and operate here and create jobs here. Then secondly, they need workers to fulfill their job requirements. So then we have to then see how and what can we do so that our workers, as time goes by, continues to be renewed in their skills so that they are evergreen, if I can sort of use that concept. The thing change, but they renew themselves and therefore always remain relevant. And if you can do that, that together with the law, that together with a viable economy that continues to create jobs and therefore the demand for labor, when put everything together, then you have a fighting chance. But if your economy tanks and there are 10 workers of varying ages and there are only 2 jobs, then no law can guarantee 10 jobs for all the 10. So the economic part of it is very important, but if there is a job, then how do we give a fair go for our older workers? So the wherewithal, the skills and so on, the health.
Helen, what's your take on this?
You mentioned about retirement adequacy earlier on. I mean, you could look at retirement in various ways. There are some, it was quite interesting, in some of the classes that I've conducted for older workers, they said, do we have to work until we drop dead? They have this perception.
That is why I want to spend time, and I spent time just now trying to explain the difference between ours and some other places. Well, first of all, nobody is forced to work one more day than he or she wishes. Anyone, whatever age, right?
You can just quit, all right?
Exactly. So everybody knows that is the case, and somehow or other that misperception persists in some cases.
Yeah, so it's really as a perception. But retirement adequacy is certainly a worrying, concerning area, which is why I think the government has been promoting, employment and employability of older workers. And I think in a sense, there are many benefits associated with working. So many older workers themselves want to continue to work. They do not want to rely on their children, for financial support. In fact, a recent study by the NUS as well, Center for Aging Research and Education, also revealed that they are afraid of conflicts that could be created because of they are having to rely on their children for financial support. That study revealed that. And also they are afraid that their children may then put them in a nursing home, because, if they are not able to support themselves. So this is based on the evidence, the research that has been carried out, I think 2020, 2021, around that period. So it's a pretty recent study, which is why I think older workers themselves recognize that, and then they also recognize that their longevity, that life expectancies have increased, and they need to continue to work to support themselves. So I think that part about reliance on family is certainly a worry, a concern for them.
In general, I think if you ask a person that says that, if you have to live long, what else would you like to add on besides the number of years you're alive? I think the person will probably think and say that I want to live well, however you define well, and have peace of mind. So if you think this way, live long, live well, and with peace of mind, then notions of how can I earn my keep, secure my retirement as best as possible, how can I remain relevant and in demand so that together with the measures taken by the state and taken by employers and unions, that I can then continue to be in demand. I think that is the thing. And then on top of that, what else can they do to hold me up where there are gaps that I may get displaced involuntarily and all that? That will then go towards the peace of mind, and in the retirement adequacy, that how do I continue to know that as a society that we will cohere, and that this mutual trust and mutual support that is very characteristic of Singapore society, that we will continue to nurture and foster this part. So I think those would be the things that will stand us in good stead.
I think I just want to, some final points here, just encapsulated in perhaps I'll say 4 A's. First of all, I cannot overemphasize that point about assumptions.
Okay.
Refraining from assumptions, right? We need to really dispel all these ageist myths about older adults, older workers. Now, secondly, the next A that I would say is assimilation. Assimilate older workers and, in fact, seniors into society. And we could form various structures, create policies and structures to assimilate them to our society. And we need to do that. Thirdly, I think we need to promote the agency of older workers. Older agency meaning autonomy, independence. And so employment is one strategy, one way in which that agency could be promoted, to encourage them to take charge, to decide for themselves what do they want, ultimately what do they want for themselves, and not to feel that, everything is being imposed upon me. Yeah, they can take charge of that. And finally, the last A is advocacy. As people who work with older adults and society at large, I would say we need to continue to advocate for seniors, for older workers, so that they could live out their supposedly golden years really in a golden way. And not to feel that they are forgotten and discarded and nobody wants them, and they're just. And I think if we want to create a society that is really that value older persons, and we are going to get there too, right? And and I think by the way that we treat older people today, right, we are going to be treated in the same way in future. Yeah, in the same way. Yeah. So I think we just need to be mindful about that.
Everybody wants to feel that he matters.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Helen Ko. Thank you, Mr. Heng Chee. Today we learned a new acronym, 4 A's. So thank you for talking about the ageism in Singapore, and hopefully we can help to reduce such incidents in the workplace, in this society, and build a better Singapore, right? Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Our pleasure.
Kaixin. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you all for listening in. See you on the next episode of On Diversity. On Diversity is a podcast inspired by the Institute of Policy Studies Managing Diversity's research program. We are available on Omni.fm, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. Please follow or subscribe to the On Diversity podcast to get notified when we have a new episode. You can visit our website, ipscommons.sg, for more information.